What's up, history buffs? Today we're diving into the question that makes even seasoned historians squirm in their chairs. Caligula, the emperor who slept with his sister and declared war on Neptune. And before you click away thinking this is just another clickbait history video, let me tell you something. The real story is so much more twisted than any HBO drama you've ever binged. We're talking about a guy who literally tried to make his horse a consul, demanded people worship him as a living god, and oh yeah, allegedly had intimate relationships with all three of his sisters. Smash that like button if you're ready for the unfiltered, no-holds-barred truth about Rome's most notorious psychopath, and drop a comment telling me, what's the craziest thing you think a person with unlimited power would do? Because I guarantee Caligula did worse. Picture this. You're living in Rome, 37 AD. The beloved Emperor Tiberius just died, and everyone's celebrating because finally, they're getting a new ruler. The people are literally dancing in the streets, throwing parties, sacrificing animals in Thanksgiving. Why? Because the new emperor is young, charismatic, and comes from the legendary bloodline of Augustus himself. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but everyone calls him by his childhood nickname, Caligula, which means little boots. Sounds adorable, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. See, those little boots were military boots he wore as a toddler when his father Germanicus took him on military campaigns. Even as a kid, this future emperor was being shaped by war, violence, and the intoxicating taste of absolute power. The Roman legions loved him. This tiny kid marching around in miniature soldier gear became their mascot, their good luck charm. But here's what nobody saw coming. Here's what no Roman citizen could have possibly predicted as they celebrated in the streets that day. They had just welcomed into power a man who would redefine the very concept of imperial madness, a man who would turn the Roman Empire into his personal playground of depravity, cruelty, and mind-bending insanity. The Romans thought they were getting their golden boy. Instead, they got a monster who would make Nero look like a choir boy. An emperor who would violate every sacred Roman tradition, mock their gods, bankrupt their treasury, and commit acts so horrific that even 2,000 years later, historians debate whether some of these stories could possibly be true. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. And this is where our story gets really interesting. Most of what you think you know about Caligula is probably wrong. The sleeping with his sister, the war on Neptune, the horse consul thing. There's way more to these stories than the simplified versions you learned in school. Hold up. Before we dive deeper into this absolute madness, pause the video right now and take a guess. Do you think Caligula was born evil, or do you think power corrupted him? Because the answer to that question is going to completely change how you see this entire story. Drop your guess in the comments, and let's see who gets it right. Because what happened next in Rome wasn't just the story of one man's descent into madness. It was a masterclass in how absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it destroys everything it touches. And Caligula, he was about to touch everything. All right, folks, let's rewind and talk about how this psychopath actually got to power, because understanding Caligula's origin story is key to understanding why he became such an absolute nightmare. Remember that nickname Caligula? Little boots? Well, those boots walked through some seriously messed up family dynamics. We're talking about the Julio-Claudian dynasty here, and let me tell you, this family tree was more twisted than a pretzel factory explosion. Caligula's father was Germanicus. Think of him as the Roman equivalent of a war hero movie star. Handsome, charismatic, beloved by the troops, and absolutely lethal on the battlefield. The guy was basically Roman Captain America, and everyone expected him to become emperor someday. But here's where things get dark fast. Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances when Caligula was just 7 years old. And by mysterious, I mean probably poisoned. By his own uncle, Emperor Tiberius. Yeah, you heard that right. Caligula grew up knowing that his beloved father was most likely murdered by the man who became his adoptive grandfather and ruler. Talk about family therapy material, right? But wait, it gets worse. After Germanicus died, Caligula's mother Agrippina, And guys, remember this name because the women in this family were absolutely ruthless. She starts publicly accusing Tiberius of murder. Not smart when you're dealing with a paranoid emperor. Tiberius responds by having Agrippina and Caligula's two older brothers arrested, imprisoned, and eventually killed. So by the time Caligula is a teenager, his father's dead, his mother's banished and starving herself to death in prison, and his two older brothers have been eliminated. The only reason Caligula survived? He learned to play the game. He became the perfect little Roman prince, obedient, charming, and absolutely deadly behind those innocent eyes. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. Tiberius, the man who destroyed his family, actually grew to love Caligula. The old emperor saw something in this kid that reminded him of himself, or maybe of the son he'd lost. Tiberius starts grooming Caligula as his heir, bringing him to live on the island of Capri. And Capri, my friends, was where Tiberius had turned into a complete degenerate. We're talking about orgies, torture chambers, people being thrown off cliffs for entertainment. This was Caligula's finishing school. For 6 years, from age 19 to 25, he lived in this twisted paradise, learning that emperors could literally do anything they wanted to anyone they wanted. But here's the really scary part. Caligula was apparently the perfect student. Never complained, never showed disgust, never revealed what he was really thinking. One Roman historian said that there had never been a better slave or a worse master than Caligula. Think about that for a second. This is a guy who watched his entire family get systematically destroyed, then spent his formative adult years learning advanced techniques in cruelty and depravity from the man who killed them all. And the whole time he's smiling and playing the devoted grandson. If you're still with me, you're about to witness how all that pent-up rage and learned psychopathy exploded when Caligula finally got his hands on absolute power. And spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, some people whispered that Caligula might have helped him along. Smothered him with a pillow, maybe, or just let him die when he could have saved him. We'll never know for sure, but honestly, after everything this family put each other through, it would almost be weird if there wasn't some murder involved. Drop a comment if you think Caligula was justified in wanting revenge, or if you think he should have been the bigger person. Because what he does next is going to make you question everything you think you know about justice and power. Buckle up, Buttercup, because this is where our story takes a hard left turn into absolutely bonkers territory. When Caligula becomes emperor at age 24, something incredible happens. Rome falls head over heels in love with him. And I mean love. We're talking about spontaneous street parties, people literally weeping tears of joy, mass celebrations that lasted for weeks. The Senate immediately votes him all the powers of an emperor, the Praetorian Guard swears absolute loyalty, and the common people are chanting his name in the streets. Why? Because after years of Tiberius being a paranoid, miserly hermit who barely showed his face in public, suddenly they have this young, gorgeous, charismatic emperor who seems to genuinely care about them. Caligula starts his reign like he's running for class president. He gives out massive bonuses to the troops, throws elaborate public games, recalls all the political exiles, and even honors his dead family members with public ceremonies. For about 7 months, Caligula is basically the Roman equivalent of JFK, young, handsome, popular, and apparently destined for greatness. The people are thinking they've hit the jackpot. Finally, an emperor who gets it. But then something happens that changes everything. And guys, this is where historians start arguing, because what happens next is so dramatic that some people think it's the key to understanding everything Caligula does afterward. In October of 37 AD, just 7 months into his reign, Caligula gets sick. Not just a little under the weather. We're talking about a serious, life-threatening illness that has him unconscious and delirious for days. Some historians think it was encephalitis. Others suggest poisoning. Some say it was a complete mental breakdown from the stress of ruling an empire. Here's what we know for sure. The man who recovered from that illness was not the same person who went into it. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever had an experience that completely changed your personality. Because what happens to Caligula next is like the ultimate version of that, except he has access to the entire Roman military and treasury. When Caligula wakes up from this mysterious illness, the first thing he does is something so shocking that it becomes legendary. Remember, his uncle Tiberius had this guy named Macro, who was basically his right-hand man, head of the Praetorian Guard, the person who helped Caligula secure power in the first place? Caligula forces Macro to commit suicide. Just like that. No trial, no explanation, no warning. The man who put him on the throne is suddenly an enemy who has to die, but that's just the warm-up act. Next, Caligula decides that his sisters, and we're talking about his actual blood sisters here, should be honored like goddesses. He puts their faces on coins, which in Roman culture is basically declaring them divine. He starts including them in all official oaths of loyalty that people have to swear to him. And here's where things get really weird. He begins appearing with them in public in ways that make everyone extremely uncomfortable. The Romans start whispering. And in Rome, when people start whispering about the emperor's relationship with his sisters, you know things have gone completely off the rails. But the sister thing, that's nothing compared to what he does next. Caligula decides that since he's emperor, he should probably also be a god. Not after he dies. That was the traditional Roman way. Right now, while he's alive, people should worship him as a literal deity. He starts demanding that people offer sacrifices to him, builds temples in his own honor, and this is where it gets absolutely insane. He begins having conversations with statues of other gods. Picture this. You're a Roman senator. You walk into the palace for a meeting, and you find your emperor having a full-blown argument with a marble statue of Jupiter about who's more powerful, and he's losing the argument to a statue that he's talking to himself. Real talk. If this was happening today, this guy would be in a padded room getting serious psychiatric help. But in ancient Rome, this guy controlled the most powerful military force in the world. Plot twist incoming. Because just when you think Caligula can't get any weirder, he decides to take his god complex international, and that's when he declares war on Neptune. All right, everyone. Gather round because we're about to dive into the most gloriously insane military campaign in human history. And when I say dive, I mean it literally, because Caligula is about to wage war against the ocean itself. Picture this. It's 40 AD, and Caligula decides he wants to invade Britain. Sounds reasonable, right? Romans had been talking about conquering Britain for decades. Julius Caesar had tried it, but never really finished the job. So Caligula marches his entire army, we're talking about 8 legions, roughly 200,000 men, all the way to the northern coast of Gaul, modern-day France. The troops are pumped. They're thinking, finally, a real war. We're going to cross the English Channel and show those barbarian Brits what Roman steel feels like. They spend weeks preparing ships, gathering supplies, sharpening their weapons. This is going to be legendary. But here's where things go completely sideways. When they reach the coast and Caligula sees the English Channel stretching out in front of him, something snaps in that twisted brain of his. Instead of ordering the invasion of Britain, he looks out at the ocean and apparently decides that the sea itself has insulted him. No, I'm not making this up. This actually happened. Caligula orders his troops to line up in battle formation on the beach. 8 legions of Rome's finest soldiers standing at attention facing the ocean like it's an enemy army. Then, and guys, I need you to really visualize this because it's so absurd it's almost beautiful, he commands them to attack the waves. That's right. The Roman army, the most disciplined military force in the ancient world, is now stabbing the ocean with their swords and throwing their spears at incoming waves. But wait, it gets better. Caligula doesn't just want them to fight the sea, he wants them to collect trophies from their victory. So he orders every single soldier to gather seashells as proof of their conquest over Neptune's domain. Hundreds of thousands of grown men, trained killers, are now wandering around a beach collecting seashells like they're on a family vacation. Hold up, pause the video right now and guess what happens next. Do you think the soldiers revolt? Do you think they just go along with it? because the answer is going to tell you everything you need to know about how absolute power works in practice. They go along with it, every single one of them. Why? Because Caligula is standing there in full imperial regalia, deadly serious, treating this like the most important military operation in Roman history. And if you're a Roman legionnaire and your emperor, who literally controls whether you live or die, orders you to stab the ocean, you stab the damn ocean. After hours of this aquatic warfare, Caligula declares victory over Neptune. He has his soldiers pile up their seashells like their enemy weapons captured in battle. He writes dispatches back to Rome describing this great triumph over the forces of the sea. He even awards himself military honors for defeating an opponent that, let's be honest, never actually fought back. But here's the really twisted part. When Caligula returns to Rome, he doesn't just pretend this was a normal military campaign. He throws a full triumph parade. You know what a Roman triumph was? It was the highest honor a general could receive, reserved for conquering actual enemies and expanding the empire. Julius Caesar got triumphs for conquering Gaul. Augustus got triumphs for defeating Mark Antony. Caligula throws himself a triumph parade for collecting seashells. Picture the scene. Hundreds of thousands of Romans lining the streets, cheering and throwing flowers, while their emperor rides through the city in a golden chariot, celebrating his victory over the ocean. Behind him, wagons full of seashells like their captured treasure. Veterans of real wars watching this parade and trying to figure out if they're having a collective nightmare. And the most insane part? The crowd goes wild for it. They cheer. They celebrate. They act like Caligula just conquered the known world. Because that's what happens when you live under a dictator. Reality becomes whatever the dictator says it is. Real talk. This next part is going to sound even more unbelievable, but we're just getting started. Because declaring war on Neptune was apparently just Caligula warming up for his real masterpiece of insanity. And that masterpiece involved his sisters in ways that would make Jerry Springer blush. Listen up, because I'm about to tell you a story so twisted that if it was fiction, you'd say it was too unrealistic. But this is history, folks. And sometimes history is stranger and more disturbing than anything Hollywood could dream up. Let's talk about Caligula's sisters. Agrippina the Younger, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. In Roman society, sisters of the emperor were supposed to be respected, protected, maybe married off to important allies. They were supposed to be symbols of imperial dignity and family values. Caligula had other ideas. Remember how I mentioned earlier that he started putting his sisters on coins and including them in loyalty oaths? Well, that was just the beginning. What Caligula did next broke every single taboo in Roman society, and Romans had a lot of taboos. First, he starts appearing in public with his sisters in ways that make everyone deeply uncomfortable. We're talking about intimate dinners where they're all reclining on the same couch. And in Roman culture, that's basically announcing to the world that something inappropriate is happening. Roman historians describe banquets where Caligula would openly fondle his sisters in front of guests, like he was daring anyone to say something about it. But here's where it gets really dark. Caligula doesn't just break the incest taboo, he weaponizes it. He starts using his relationships with his sisters as a tool of political terror. Senators who oppose him suddenly find themselves invited to dinners where they have to watch the emperor commit acts that would normally get a Roman citizen exiled or executed. Think about the psychology of this for a second. Caligula is forcing the most powerful men in Rome to witness something that violates their deepest cultural values, and they can't say anything about it because he's the emperor. It's like the ultimate power move. I can do things that would destroy you, and you have to sit there and smile. And here's the most twisted part. It gets worse with Julia Drusilla. Most historians agree that if Caligula had an actual intimate relationship with any of his sisters, it was with Drusilla. She becomes his favorite, his constant companion, the one person in the world he seems to genuinely care about. Drop a comment if you think this kind of behavior comes from trauma, mental illness, or just pure evil, because what happens next is going to blow your mind. In 38 AD, Julia Drusilla dies. Could be natural causes, could be illness, could be anything. But Caligula's reaction? It's like watching someone have a complete psychological breakdown in real time. First, he declares a period of public mourning, not unusual for an emperor's sister. But then he takes it further. He makes it illegal for anyone in the empire to laugh, bathe, or dine with their families while he's grieving. The entire Roman world has to suffer because Caligula lost his sister. Then it gets weird. Really weird. Caligula declares Drusilla a goddess. Not just any goddess, but a major deity who deserves temples and priests and sacrifices. He claims she's been taken up to live among the gods, and that he regularly receives visits from her divine spirit. But here's the kicker, and this is where you realize just how far gone this guy is. Caligula starts claiming that he's going to join Drusilla in the divine realm. He begins preparing for his own death, not because he's suicidal, but because he believes dying will reunite him with his deified sister in heaven, except he doesn't actually want to die. So instead, he decides to become a god while he's still alive. And that's when Caligula goes from being merely crazy to being dangerously, historically, world-changingly insane. He orders the construction of a massive temple in Rome dedicated to himself as a living god. He demands that every statue of a Greek or Roman deity in the empire have its head removed and replaced with his own face. Picture walking into the Pantheon and seeing Zeus with Caligula's head on it. That's the level of megalomania we're dealing with here. But here's where things get really interesting, and this is going to change how you see this whole story. Some modern historians think the incest allegations might have been exaggerated or even fabricated by Caligula's enemies after his death. Plot twist incoming. Because what if I told you that some of these stories were designed to make Caligula look like a monster to justify what happens next? And what happens next involves a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of Roman government. But here's where things get really wild. Before we get to that conspiracy, we need to talk about just how completely unhinged Caligula became in his final years. Because the sister scandal and the Neptune War, those were just warm-up acts for the main event. By 39 AD, Caligula has decided that being emperor of Rome isn't enough. He wants to be worshipped as Jupiter himself, the king of the gods. And he doesn't just want people to pretend to worship him. He wants them to believe it, to feel it, to literally see him as divine. So he does what any rational person would do in this situation. He starts dressing up like different gods and demanding that people sacrifice to him. Monday, he's Jupiter, complete with fake lightning bolts. Tuesday, he's Mars, wearing full battle armor. Wednesday, he might be Apollo, playing a liar badly and forcing senators to applaud like he's the next Mozart. But the absolute pinnacle of his god complex comes when he decides to have a conversation with the statue of Jupiter in Rome's most sacred temple. Not just any conversation, a full-blown diplomatic negotiation between two deities about who's really in charge of the universe. Picture this. Caligula walks into the temple of Jupiter, approaches this massive statue that Romans have been revering for centuries, and starts arguing with it about territorial disputes in the divine realm. He's gesturing wildly, raising his voice, apparently getting frustrated that Jupiter isn't responding fast enough. Then, and this is where you know this guy has completely lost touch with reality, Caligula decides that since Jupiter won't acknowledge his divinity through words, they should settle it through combat. So he challenges a marble statue to a wrestling match. I wish I was making this up. The emperor of Rome is literally trying to physically fight a statue of Jupiter while his terrified guards watch from the doorway, probably wondering if they should intervene or just start looking for new jobs. Real talk. If you're still with me at this point, you're probably thinking what everyone in Rome was thinking. This can't go on much longer. And you'd be right, because by 40 AD, Caligula has managed to terrify, bankrupt, and thoroughly piss off pretty much everyone who matters in the Roman Empire. He's executed senators for sneezing at the wrong moment. He's forced parents to watch their children be tortured. He's made people worship him before they're allowed to buy bread. The guy has basically turned Rome into his personal horror movie, and he's the star, director, and producer all rolled into one. But here's the thing that's really going to mess with your head. Some historians argue that Caligula might not have been completely insane. What if some of this behavior was calculated? What if he was using apparent madness as a tool to maintain absolute power? Think about it this way. If everyone thinks you're unpredictably crazy, they're less likely to plot against you because they can't predict how you'll react. If you do things that are so shocking and taboo-breaking that people can't even process them, you keep everyone off balance. It's like psychological warfare against your own government. Hold up. Before we continue down this rabbit hole, drop a comment and tell me, do you think Caligula was genuinely insane, or was he a brilliant manipulator using madness as a political strategy? Because the answer to that question changes everything about how we interpret what happens next. What happens next is that some very important Romans decide they've had enough. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, are starting to whisper among themselves. Senators who haven't been executed yet are meeting in secret. Even Caligula's closest advisors are beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it's time for a change in leadership. And that's when they start planning the most audacious political assassination since Julius Caesar. Except this time, they're not just killing an emperor, they're putting down what they believe is a rabid animal that happens to wear a purple robe. Buckle up, because we're about to dive into one of the most intense assassination plots in history. And unlike Julius Caesar's death, which was all about political ideology and saving the Republic, Caligula's assassination was pure survival instinct. These conspirators weren't thinking about Rome's future. They were thinking about making it to tomorrow alive. By January 41st AD, the conspiracy against Caligula includes some absolutely crucial players. First, you've got Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer in the Praetorian Guard. This guy has been Caligula's bodyguard for years, which means he's had a front-row seat to every single act of madness, cruelty, and depravity. Chaerea has watched Caligula torture innocent people for entertainment, force senators to grovel like dogs, and claim to have conversations with gods. But here's what really pushed Chaerea over the edge. Caligula had been publicly mocking him for having what the emperor considered an effeminate voice. In front of other guards, in front of senators, Caligula would make Chaerea repeat humiliating passwords and then laugh at how he sounded. For a Roman military officer, this kind of public emasculation was basically a death sentence for your reputation. So Chaerea starts reaching out to other people who have reasons to want Caligula dead. And guess what? That's pretty much everyone in Rome with any power or influence. You've got senators whose colleagues have been executed on whims. You've got wealthy Romans who've been forced to give their fortunes to fund Caligula's insane building projects. You've got Praetorian Guards who are tired of being ordered to commit atrocities against Roman citizens. But the conspiracy gets really interesting when it includes Marcus Vinicius and Annius Vinicianus. These are consuls, some of the most powerful men in Rome. When people at that level start plotting against you, you know you've really screwed up. Now here's where the story gets absolutely wild. These conspirators realize they have a problem. How do you kill someone who never goes anywhere without a heavily armed bodyguard of men who are literally sworn to die protecting him? The answer: you get some of those bodyguards to join the conspiracy. Real talk. This next part is going to sound like something out of a spy thriller, but this actually happened. Chaerea starts secretly recruiting other Praetorian Guards, one by one, testing their loyalty, figuring out who's reached their breaking point with Caligula's madness. And here's what he discovers. Almost everyone is ready to turn. The guards are exhausted from being forced to participate in Caligula's cruelty. They're embarrassed by having to protect someone who claims to be a god. They're terrified that one day they'll be the ones on the wrong end of his paranoid rage. But they need the perfect opportunity. They need a moment when Caligula is vulnerable, when they can act quickly and decisively before anyone can stop them. That opportunity comes during the Palatine Games in January 41 AD. These are major public festivals with theatrical performances, gladiator fights, religious ceremonies, basically ancient Rome's version of the Super Bowl combined with Comic-Con. Caligula loves these events because they give him a chance to show off, to be worshipped by crowds, to remind everyone who's in charge. The conspirators realize this is their shot. During the games, Caligula will be moving around the palace complex, going between different venues, surrounded by crowds and distractions. If they time it right, they can catch him in a relatively isolated moment. Drop a comment if you think you could have pulled off an assassination plot like this, or if you think you would have chickened out at the last second. Because what these guys are about to do requires nerves of absolute steel. The plan they come up with is both brilliant and terrifying. They're going to kill Caligula during the lunch break of the games, when he's walking through an underground tunnel that connects the palace to the theater. It's a narrow corridor. He'll have minimal guards with him, and here's the crucial part. Several of those guards will actually be part of the assassination plot. But here's where things get really tense, because on the morning of January 24th, 41 AD, Caligula almost doesn't go to the games at all. Listen up, because what happens on January 24th, 41 AD is like watching a perfectly choreographed dance of death, except half the dancers don't know they're dancing, and the other half are trying not to trip over their own swords. That morning, Caligula wakes up in a weird mood. And when I say weird, I mean weird even by Caligula standards. He's been having nightmares about being attacked. He's paranoid about crowds. And he keeps asking his advisors if they think he should skip the games entirely. The conspirators are watching this unfold and probably thinking, "Are you kidding me? We've planned the perfect assassination and now this psychopath is having performance anxiety?" But here's what saves the plot. Caligula's own ego. His advisors, some of whom are secretly part of the conspiracy, start telling him that the people are expecting to see their divine emperor at the games. They remind him that backing out would look weak, cowardly even. And if there's one thing Caligula can't stand, it's appearing weak in front of his subjects. So he decides to go. But he's still nervous, still jumpy. He keeps changing his mind about which routes to take, which entrances to use, how many guards to bring. The conspirators are scrambling to adjust their plan every 5 minutes. Finally, around noon, Caligula heads to the theater complex for the games. The crowd goes wild when they see him, partly because they're genuinely excited, but mostly because failing to cheer enthusiastically for the emperor is a good way to end up dead. The games are spectacular. We're talking about elaborate theatrical productions, exotic animals, gladiator fights that would make Russell Crowe jealous. Caligula is in his element, basking in the attention, playing the role of divine emperor for thousands of adoring subjects. But then, during the lunch break, something happens that changes everything. Caligula stands up to leave the theater, heading back to the palace for a meal. This is the moment the conspirators have been waiting for. He's going to walk through that narrow underground tunnel, the one they've chosen as their killing ground. As they start moving toward the tunnel, Cassius Chaerea positions himself close to Caligula. Other conspirators spread out through the small group of guards and advisors. Everyone knows their role. Everyone knows this is it. But then, plot twist. Caligula suddenly decides he wants to stay and watch more of the games. Just like that. No explanation, no warning. He sits back down and starts watching a group of young performers on stage. The conspirators are freaking out. They've psyched themselves up for this moment. They've got everyone in position, and now their target is changing his mind again. Some of them start to wonder if they should call the whole thing off. But Chaerea makes a command decision. He walks up to Caligula and whispers something in his ear. We don't know exactly what he said, but whatever it was, it worked. Caligula gets up and starts walking toward the tunnel. Here's where everything happens at once, and it happens fast. They're in the tunnel now. Caligula, Chaerea, and about a dozen other people, half of whom are about to commit treason. The space is narrow, cramped, dimly lit, perfect for what's about to happen. Chaerea strikes first. He comes up behind Caligula and drives his sword between the emperor's shoulder and neck. It's not a killing blow, but it's enough to bring Caligula to his knees, screaming. And that's when all hell breaks loose. The other conspirators start stabbing. We're talking about a feeding frenzy of violence, everyone trying to get their blade into the emperor before he can call for help or before any loyal guards can intervene. Within seconds, Caligula is covered in blood, still alive but barely, crawling on the ground and begging for mercy. But here's the most chilling part. According to the historians who recorded this, Caligula's last words weren't a curse or a threat or even a prayer. He just kept repeating, "I'm still alive! I'm still alive!" like he couldn't believe that someone had actually managed to hurt a god. 30 seconds later, he wasn't. The conspirators stand there in this narrow tunnel, covered in the blood of the most powerful man in the world, probably wondering if they just saved Rome or doomed themselves. Because killing an emperor is one thing. Surviving the aftermath is something completely different. What do you think? Was this justice finally being served? Or just another brutal power grab disguised as heroism? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what happens next is going to completely change how you see this entire story. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into absolutely chaotic territory, because killing Caligula was apparently the easy part. What happens in the hours after his death is like watching the Roman Empire have a complete nervous breakdown in real time. First, let's talk about the immediate aftermath. The conspirators are standing in this blood-soaked tunnel, and suddenly they realize they have a massive problem. They've just murdered the emperor, but they have absolutely no plan for what to do next. This wasn't like Caesar's assassination, where the conspirators had this grand vision of restoring the Roman Republic. These guys killed Caligula because he was a monster, not because they had some brilliant alternative government ready to go. They're basically the dog that caught the car. Now what? While they're standing there having their, "Oh crap, what have we done" moment, news of the assassination spreads through the palace like wildfire, and the reaction is complicated. The Praetorian Guard, the ones who weren't in on the conspiracy, go absolutely berserk. Their job is to protect the emperor, and they just failed spectacularly. Some of them start attacking anyone they think might be involved. Others start looting the palace, figuring if the emperor's dead, they might as well grab what they can before everything falls apart. The Senate, meanwhile, has what can only be described as the world's most awkward celebration. These guys have been living in terror for 4 years, watching their colleagues get executed for sneezing wrong, and suddenly their tormentor is dead. Some senators are openly weeping with relief. Others are so paranoid they think it's a trap, that Caligula is going to come back from the dead to punish them for being happy about his murder. But here's where things get really weird, and this is going to mess with your head. The common people of Rome are genuinely upset about Caligula's death. I know. This is the same guy who declared war on Neptune, tried to make his horse a consul, and allegedly slept with his sisters. But remember, the average Roman citizen didn't experience Caligula's day-to-day madness. What they saw was a young, charismatic emperor who threw amazing public games, gave out money to the people, and put on spectacular shows. To them, Caligula wasn't a psychotic tyrant. He was entertainment. He was the emperor who made their lives more interesting, more exciting. So when news of his death reaches the streets, there are actually riots. People are demanding to know who killed their beloved emperor and why they should be punished. Think about that for a second. The people who suffered the most under Caligula's reign, the senators, the wealthy, the politically connected, are celebrating his death. But the people who he actually treated pretty well, the common citizens, are mourning him like a fallen hero. Real talk. This is one of the most perfect examples in history of how different social classes can have completely opposite experiences of the same ruler. Caligula was simultaneously a beloved populist and a terrifying dictator, depending on who you were and how close you got to actual power. But here's where the story gets even more insane, because while Rome is busy having this collective identity crisis about whether Caligula was a hero or a villain, something happens that nobody saw coming. The Praetorian Guard finds Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, scared out of his mind that he's going to be executed as part of some mass purge of the imperial family. Claudius is this awkward, stuttering, physically disabled guy who everyone always assumed was too weak and stupid to be a threat to anyone. Except the Praetorian Guard looks at him and thinks, hey, he's got imperial blood, he's alive, and most importantly, he's here. So they drag him out from behind the curtain and declare him emperor on the spot. No Senate vote, no public acclamation, no careful political maneuvering. The Praetorian Guard just points at this terrified man hiding in the palace and says, "Congratulations, you're Caesar now." And Claudius, who's probably thinking this is the worst day of his life, becomes one of Rome's most successful emperors. He conquers Britain, the thing Caligula never actually did, expands the empire, builds amazing public works, and rules for 13 years. Hold up, pause the video, and tell me what you think about this. Does it seem like Caligula's death actually solved anything, or did it just reveal how broken the Roman political system really was? Because what I'm about to tell you next is going to make you question everything you think you know about power, madness, and historical truth. All right, folks, we've reached the point in our story where I need to blow your mind one more time. Because everything I've just told you about Caligula, the incest, the divine madness, the war on Neptune, even some of the cruelest executions might not be entirely true. I know. You're probably thinking, what do you mean it's not true? You just spent 40 minutes telling me all these insane stories. But here's the thing about ancient history, especially Roman history. The winners don't just write the history books. They completely rewrite them to make themselves look like heroes. And who won after Caligula died? Claudius. The stammering, limping uncle who nobody took seriously became emperor and ruled successfully for 13 years. So guess who had every reason in the world to make sure history remembered his predecessor as an absolute monster? Here's what we know for certain about Caligula. He was emperor for less than 4 years, he was assassinated by his own guards, and he definitely did some things that violated Roman traditions. Everything else? Everything else comes from sources who had political reasons to make him look as bad as possible. Think about it this way. If you wanted to justify murdering an emperor, what would you do? You'd spread stories about how he was insane, how he committed unspeakable acts, how he was a threat to everything Romans held sacred. You'd make him into such a monster that killing him looks like the only reasonable option. The incest allegations? They come from historians writing decades after Caligula's death, during reigns of emperors who needed to distance themselves from him. The war on Neptune? That story shows up in sources that are known for exaggerating and sensationalizing events for dramatic effect. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some modern historians think Caligula might have been a pretty effective ruler who just made too many enemies too quickly. Real talk. This is going to completely flip your perspective. What if Caligula wasn't crazy? What if he was just young, arrogant, and politically naive? What if he tried to reform the Roman system too fast and too aggressively, and the established power structure destroyed him for it? Consider this. Caligula gave money to the people, through spectacular public games, recalled political exiles, and tried to reduce the Senate's power. In modern terms, he was basically a populist reformer going up against an entrenched political establishment. Sound familiar? The divine honors thing? Multiple Roman emperors before and after Caligula were worshipped as gods in the eastern provinces. It was weird for Rome itself, but not unheard of in the broader empire. The sexual scandals? Roman political opponents always accused each other of sexual deviance. It was like the ancient equivalent of a Twitter smear campaign. If you wanted to destroy someone's reputation, you accused them of sleeping with family members. Even the apparent mental illness could have a different explanation. What if those stories about talking to statues and fighting the ocean were propaganda designed to make a dangerous political opponent look like a harmless lunatic? Drop a comment and tell me, does this change how you see Caligula's story? Are you more likely to believe he was genuinely insane or that he was a victim of ancient character assassination? But here's what I think is the most fascinating part of this whole story. Whether Caligula was a monster or a misunderstood reformer, whether he actually slept with his sisters or just got too close to them politically, whether he really declared war on Neptune or that was just propaganda, none of that changes the fundamental lesson of his reign. And that lesson is this. In a system where one person has absolute power, it doesn't matter if that person is good or evil, sane or crazy, beloved or hated. The system itself is the problem. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years, but it exposed every single weakness in the Roman imperial system. It showed how easily a republic could become a dictatorship, how quickly a dictator could become a tyrant, and how impossible it was to remove a bad emperor without violence and chaos. The Romans thought they had solved their political problems by creating the Principate, this system where emperors had absolute power but were supposed to use it responsibly. Caligula proved that system was built on nothing but hope and good intentions. And here's the really scary part. It could happen again, tomorrow, in any country, in any political system that concentrates too much power in the hands of one person. So here we are, at the end of one of history's most twisted tales, and I want you to think about something. Everything we've talked about today, the alleged incest, the war on Neptune, the divine madness, the brutal assassination, all of it happened because one young man was given absolute power over the most powerful empire in the world, and nobody had any legal way to stop him when things went wrong. That's the real horror story here. Not that Caligula might have been crazy, but that the Roman system made it possible for one person's mental state, whether it was genuine madness, calculated manipulation, or just youthful arrogance, to determine the fate of millions of people. And guys, let's be honest, we're not that different today. We still live in a world where individual leaders can make decisions that affect billions of lives. We still see politicians who seem to lose touch with reality when they get too much power. We still watch people do increasingly extreme things to maintain their grip on authority. The only difference is that today we have Twitter instead of marble statues to argue with. But here's what I find most fascinating about Caligula's story. It's not really about him at all. It's about us. It's about how we react when someone breaks all the rules we thought were unbreakable. It's about how we decide what's true when different groups of people have completely opposite experiences of the same events. Think about it. For almost 2,000 years, we've been telling stories about Caligula that paint him as this cartoonish villain, this over-the-top monster who did things so outrageous they seem almost mythical. But what if that's exactly what those stories were designed to do? What if they were meant to make us so focused on his individual craziness that we didn't ask harder questions about the system that created him? What do you think? Was Caligula a uniquely evil individual who would have been terrible regardless of circumstances? Or was he a product of a broken system that turned a traumatized young man into a monster? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I think the answer to that question says more about us than it does about him. Here's my take, and this might be controversial. I think Caligula was probably neither a complete monster nor an innocent victim. I think he was a young, damaged person who got way too much power way too fast and made some catastrophically bad decisions that destroyed lives and ultimately got him killed. But I also think the people who killed him weren't heroes saving Rome from tyranny. They were scared, self-interested politicians who took the law into their own hands because they didn't have any other options. And that's the most depressing part of this whole story. Nobody comes out looking good. Not Caligula, not his assassins, not the system that created the mess in the first place. So, what's the lesson here? What are we supposed to learn from this absolute train wreck of a historical episode? I think it's this. Power doesn't corrupt people. It reveals who they really are. And absolute power reveals absolutely everything, including all the stuff we'd rather not see. Caligula's reign was like holding up a mirror to Roman society and showing them all their hypocrisies, all their hidden cruelties, all their willingness to tolerate anything as long as it didn't directly threaten them. He didn't create Roman brutality. He just made it impossible to ignore. And maybe that's why his story has fascinated people for 2 millennia, because deep down, we recognize something familiar in it. We've all seen what happens when people get a little bit of power and start acting like jerks. We've all watched leaders make increasingly crazy decisions while everyone around them pretends everything is normal. We've all wondered what we would do if someone we knew was becoming dangerous, but they were also the person in charge. Caligula's story isn't ancient history. It's a warning label. It's a reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just against foreign enemies or obvious villains, but against the slow erosion of the systems that keep any one person from having too much control over our lives. What's up, history buffs? Thanks for sticking with me through this absolutely wild journey into one of the darkest chapters of Roman history. If this video blew your mind, smash that like button and let me know in the comments which crazy historical figure you want me to cover next. And remember, the craziest stories in history are usually the truest ones, even when we can't figure out exactly what the truth really was. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more insane stuff in ancient history that schools never teach you. So make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell because trust me, we're just getting started with the stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep thinking critically, and remember, absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it also makes for some absolutely incredible stories.